He told her to forget his number if she kept the baby, but 2 years later, he saw the boy, and realized he couldn't forget her. Emma never thought that a single sentence could shatter her entire world, but when Alexander said those words, everything inside her went cold. The memory of that day was burned into her mind with brutal clarity, the rain tapping against the windows of his glass-walled office, the faint scent of his cologne, the sterile silence before he spoke. She had been nervous, yes, but also hopeful. She had imagined a different kind of reaction when she told him. Maybe shock, confusion, fear even, but not this. He had stood behind his desk, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as always, until she placed the small test on the polished surface between them. His eyes flicked to it, then to her, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw something flicker there, panic, maybe even emotion. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, the same tone he used in board meetings when rejecting proposals. "If you have that baby, forget my number." The words cut through her like glass. She blinked, unable to breathe, waiting for him to take them back, to show any sign of the man she thought she loved. Instead, he turned away, straightening the cuff of his light blue shirt with mechanical precision. "You don't understand what this will do," he continued, his tone colder now. "To me, to my reputation, to everything I've built." Emma felt her stomach twist. "What it will do?" she repeated softly. "You mean what it will do to your image?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. Something inside her cracked then, something she couldn't repair. "I thought you wanted a family someday," she whispered, the words trembling. "I said I wanted control," he corrected, his voice like ice. This isn't part of the plan." For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound echoing through the vast office like a heartbeat. She could barely see him now through her tears. "You're really just going to walk away?" she asked, her voice breaking. His jaw tightened. "You'll do the right thing," he said quietly. "You always do." Then he turned and walked to the door. She called his name once, but he didn't stop. The door shut behind him with a final, soft click, and that sound echoed louder than any scream could have. Emma stood there for a long time, her mind numb, her hands trembling around the edge of his desk. The test still lay there, its faint pink lines almost mocking in their certainty. She had imagined this moment so differently. She had imagined tears of joy, maybe even a hesitant smile, some fragile hope of a future together. Instead, she was left in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of promises he never intended to keep. When she finally moved, it was like walking through a dream. She gathered her coat, her bag, and left the office without looking back. She told herself she wouldn't cry anymore, but the tears came anyway, blurring the streetlights as she stepped into the rain. The next days passed in fragments. She quit her job at his company, unable to bear the whispers or the looks. Her friends told her to forget him, that he didn't deserve her pain, but they didn't understand. She hadn't just lost a lover. She had lost the future she thought she was building, the man she thought she knew. She spent long nights awake, staring at the ceiling, her hand resting protectively over the small secret growing inside her. Every morning, she woke up telling herself she would be strong, that she would raise her child without him. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the loneliness pressed down like a weight, she wondered how she would ever do it. As the months went by, her body changed, and so did she. She stopped checking the news for his name, stopped hoping for a message that never came. Each time she felt the baby kick, she whispered promises into the dark. "You will never be unwanted," she would say softly. "You will never feel alone." When the pain of labor finally came, she went through it by herself in a small hospital room with no flowers, no father waiting outside, no one to hold her hand. But when she heard the first cry of her son, everything else fell away. She held him close, tracing the curve of his cheek, the tiny curl of his fingers, and when she looked into his blue eyes, his father's eyes, something inside her healed and broke all at once. That night, as she sat in the dim hospital room, the world outside blurred with snow, Emma made a vow. She would never beg Alexander to see them, never chase after someone who had chosen to leave. She would build a life for her son, a quiet, steady one, without the shadow of his father looming over them. And if one day Alexander ever realized what he had thrown away, it would be too late. She didn't know then that fate had its own cruel way of circling back, or that 2 years later, she would look up from a park bench, sunlight glinting off the fountain, and see him standing there, frozen, staring at the child who bore his eyes and his soul. But on that first night, she only held her baby close, whispered his name, Michael, and promised him a world where love didn't have to hurt. The first few months after Michael was born passed in a blur of exhaustion and quiet determination. Emma had never known loneliness like that before, loneliness that wasn't about being alone, but about having no one to share the moments with. Every cry, every sleepless night, every tiny miracle belonged only to her. There were days she felt like she was made entirely of fatigue, her body aching, her heart bruised from holding back tears. Yet when she looked down at her son sleeping in her arms, all the pain seemed to make sense. He was so small, so fragile, and yet he carried within him a strength that felt ancient, as though life itself had chosen her to protect him. Money was always tight. She worked part-time at a small local library, the kind with creaky floors and shelves that smelled like dust and time. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Brooks, took pity on her and let her bring Michael in during quiet shifts. While Emma sorted returned books or stacked shelves, Michael would sit in a stroller near the window, watching the rain or the people passing by. Sometimes, the older woman would come over, hand Emma a cup of tea, and whisper, "You're doing fine, dear. You're doing just fine." It was such a simple thing, but it kept her going. Every little kindness did. There were moments of beauty too, hidden among the struggles. On cold winter mornings, she would wake before dawn, wrap Michael in blankets, and sit by the small window, watching the city slowly come alive. The lights would flicker on one by one, the streets filling with the hum of life, and she would whisper stories to him about a world that could still be kind. Sometimes, she imagined what Alexander was doing at that very moment, maybe sitting in a boardroom somewhere, his tie perfect, his eyes cold, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives but never looking back on the one he had changed forever. She didn't hate him anymore, hate required too much energy. What she felt now was quieter, heavier. It was something closer to mourning. As Michael grew, his personality began to bloom. He was endlessly curious, fascinated by the smallest things, a leaf, a book, the sound of the wind through the trees. He would laugh so hard that she couldn't help but laugh too, no matter how tired she was. He loved to point at the world around him, naming things in his soft, baby voice, his favorite word being light. It was fitting, Emma thought. He was her light. There were nights when she would watch him sleep and think about how much he resembled his father, not just in his eyes but in the way he tilted his head or furrowed his brow when something puzzled him. Those moments were hard. It was like seeing Alexander again, but softer, innocent, unspoiled by the world. Sometimes, she whispered to him, as if speaking to them both, "You'll be better than him. You'll be the kind of man he never learned to be." Life settled into a fragile rhythm. Emma learned to navigate the city with a stroller and a book bag, to stretch every dollar until it became enough. She made friends with other mothers in the park, women who didn't ask too many questions but always offered a smile or a snack for Michael. The days were long, but they were hers, built from the quiet pride of survival. There were still moments when fear gripped her, like when Michael got sick for the first time, his tiny body burning with fever, and she spent the night sitting by his crib, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. But every challenge only made her stronger, more certain that leaving Alexander behind had been the only choice she could live with. Sometimes, at night, she dreamed of him. In her dreams, he wasn't cold or cruel. He was the man she had once thought he was, the one who smiled softly when she laughed, who kissed her forehead when she was nervous before a meeting, who once told her she made his world less gray. Those dreams were the worst because they reminded her that, beneath all the hurt, she still remembered the man he had pretended to be. But every morning, she would wake, see Michael beside her, and the dream would fade. Reality, though harsh, was hers. It didn't lie. By the time Michael turned 2, the small apartment had become a home filled with laughter, mess, and color. There were drawings on the fridge, toys scattered on the floor, and a bookshelf full of children's stories Emma had collected from the library's donation bin. On weekends, they went to the park together. Michael loved the fountain, the sound of the water splashing, the way sunlight danced on the ripples. He would run toward it every time, his small feet barely keeping balance, his laughter echoing through the air. Emma would chase after him, her heart full. In those moments, she forgot everything else. The past didn't matter. The future didn't frighten her. There was only now, their small, perfect world of 2. She had no way of knowing that the very place she went to feel safe, the park with its fountain and soft laughter, would become the stage for the most unexpected moment of her life. Because one afternoon, as she sat on a bench watching Michael play, she would look up and see a man standing across the square, a man in a tailored light gray suit, with sun glinting off his hair, his piercing blue eyes fixed not on her, but on the little boy who looked exactly like him. And in that instant, everything she had built, everything she had fought to protect, would begin to tremble. The day began like any other, warm sunlight slipping through the thin curtains, the quiet sound of birds outside her small apartment window, and Michael's laughter echoing through the hallway as he tried to put his shoes on by himself. Emma smiled, tying his laces when he got frustrated, and promised him they would go feed the ducks after they stopped by the fountain. It was one of those rare, calm mornings when everything felt soft and peaceful, the kind of day that made her forget the chaos that once ruled her life. She didn't know that this simple outing would change everything. The park was busy, filled with families and couples, the air full of laughter and the smell of freshly baked pretzels from a nearby stand. Michael ran ahead, his little hands clutching his toy truck, his curls bouncing in the sunlight. Emma followed close behind, watching him with a quiet pride that only a mother could feel. He stopped near the fountain, fascinated as always by the way the water sparkled, and she sat on a bench nearby, taking a deep breath. It was one of those moments where she truly felt content. Her world was small, but it was safe, and for once, she believed that was enough. But peace has a cruel way of ending when you least expect it. She noticed him before she fully understood who he was. A tall man across the square, standing still while the world moved around him. His light brown hair caught the sunlight, his posture confident yet strangely tense. He was on the phone at first, his voice low, his eyes scanning the area as if searching for something, or someone. Emma's heart skipped, her mind whispering no, no, it can't be him, not here, not now. But then he turned. For a second, their eyes met, and everything inside her froze. Time seemed to stop, the sounds of the park faded into a dull hum. Alexander Hayes was standing just a few steps away, as real and unshakable as the day she last saw him. Her breath caught in her throat as 100 emotions crashed over her, shock, anger, fear, and something else she didn't want to name. She thought about running, about grabbing Michael and leaving before he noticed, but it was too late. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes she used to know so well, were no longer on her. They were on the boy playing by the fountain. Emma's pulse quickened as she watched realization dawn on his face. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. His gaze locked on Michael, studying the shape of his face, the soft brown curls, the tilt of his head. The resemblance was undeniable. It was like looking at a smaller, purer version of himself. The color drained from his face, and he took a small step forward, as if drawn by something beyond his control. Emma rose from the bench, instinctively moving toward her son, her heart hammering so hard she could barely think. Michael turned at the sound of her footsteps and ran into her arms, laughing. "Mommy, look! The water's dancing," he said joyfully, his eyes wide with excitement. She tried to smile, to pretend nothing was wrong, but her body was trembling. Over Michael's shoulder, Alexander was still standing there, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with something she had never seen in him before, raw disbelief, maybe even pain. He started walking toward them. Each step felt like an eternity. Emma's fingers tightened around Michael's hand. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the crowd, but she couldn't move. When he finally stopped in front of her, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Emma?" The sound of her name on his lips after all this time hit her like a wave. She lifted her chin, forcing her voice to stay steady. "You shouldn't be here." He ignored her tone, his gaze flicking between her and Michael. "Is he?" His voice faltered. For a man who had once commanded boardrooms, who could silence anyone with a single glance, he suddenly looked powerless. "You don't get to ask that question," she said sharply, pulling her son closer. "You made your choice." Michael looked up curiously, sensing the tension. "Mommy, who is that?" Before Emma could answer, Alexander crouched down, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "An old friend," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Michael, innocent and open, smiled back. "Hi. I'm Michael," he said proudly. Alexander's breath hitched. Hearing his own name, the one he had chosen for himself as a child, come from this little boy felt like a knife twisting deep in his chest. He didn't need a DNA test. The truth was right there, staring at him with eyes that mirrored his own. Emma's hands trembled as she turned away, desperate to end this moment before it tore her apart. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly to her son. "We're leaving." She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze on them, heavy and broken. As she walked away, her heart pounded in her chest, each step echoing with memories she had tried so hard to bury. Alexander stood rooted to the spot long after they disappeared into the crowd. His mind was spinning, replaying every word he had said to her years ago, every cruel decision, every moment of pride that now felt meaningless. He had spent years building an empire, and yet in a single afternoon, one small child had undone him completely. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, regret. Not the kind that passes quickly, but the kind that settles deep in the bones, that gnaws at you from the inside. He had wanted control over his life, over everything, but standing there, he realized he had lost control of the only thing that had ever truly mattered. When he finally left the park, he didn't go back to his office. He didn't call his assistant or his driver. He walked for hours through the city, his mind consumed with questions and memories. Every corner seemed to remind him of her, the way she used to smile when she talked about the future, the sound of her laughter, the softness in her eyes when she had told him she loved him. He had destroyed all of it with one sentence. And now, 2 years later, he had to face the truth: he hadn't just lost her. He had lost his son. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The image of Alexander standing by the fountain replayed in her mind over and over until it blurred with the darkness around her. She lay in bed with Michael curled against her, his small hand resting over her heart, and felt her chest tighten. For 2 years, she had lived as though that chapter of her life no longer existed, as though it belonged to someone else, a different Emma, one who had believed in love, in promises, in the future she thought she could build with him. Seeing him again had ripped that illusion wide open. She could still hear the disbelief in his voice when he said her name, the way his eyes widened when he looked at Michael. She had wanted to scream at him, to tell him he had no right to feel anything, not after the words he had thrown at her like stones. Instead, she had done the only thing she could, walk away. In the morning, the world went on as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast, packed Michael's small backpack for daycare, and went to work at the library. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, she couldn't stop replaying the encounter. Every detail clung to her, the way he looked older, the faint tiredness around his eyes, the hesitation in his voice. He had always been so composed, so sure of himself, and yet yesterday he had looked lost. Part of her wanted to believe that meant something, that maybe he finally understood what he had done. But the other part of her, the one that had survived his rejection, warned her not to fall for ghosts. When she went to pick up Michael that afternoon, she found him sitting by the window, playing with his toy cars. His smile melted everything. "Mommy," he shouted, running to her with his arms wide open. She scooped him up, burying her face in his hair, breathing in his scent, grounding herself in the only truth that mattered. But even then, as she held him, she felt the weight of that moment at the park. The possibility that Alexander might try to find them gnawed at her. She couldn't let him disrupt the life she had built, not now. What she didn't know was that Alexander hadn't slept either. He had spent the night pacing his penthouse apartment, haunted by the memory of the little boy's face. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Michael's eyes staring back at him, identical to his own. He poured himself a drink, then another, but nothing dulled the ache in his chest. He tried to reason with himself, to apply the same logic that had guided every decision he'd made in business: control, detachment, clarity. But this was different. This was chaos, and for the first time, he didn't know what to do. At dawn, he sat by the window of his apartment, watching the city below, and realized how hollow it all felt. The success, the power, the endless meetings, it all meant nothing now. For years, he had convinced himself that cutting Emma out of his life had been the right choice, that he had done it to protect himself, to protect his reputation. But now he understood the truth he had refused to face: he had been a coward. He had loved her, more than he'd ever admitted, and he had destroyed that love out of fear. By mid-morning, he made a decision. He would find her. Not to claim anything, not yet, but because he needed to see them again. He needed to understand what kind of life they had built without him, what kind of man his son was becoming. He called his assistant, asked her to cancel his meetings, and spent the next few hours searching through old records. It didn't take long. Alexander Hayes had always had the means to find anyone. Within a day, he had an address. Emma was leaving the library when she saw the car parked across the street, a sleek black sedan that didn't belong in her quiet neighborhood. Her stomach dropped when the driver stepped out and opened the door for the man inside. She froze. Alexander emerged, dressed in a dark coat, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt heavy with everything left unsaid. She was the first to speak. "You shouldn't be here," she said again, her voice steadier this time. He took a step forward, his eyes softening. "I had to see you." She shook her head. "You've seen enough." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Please, Emma. I just want to talk." Her instinct screamed at her to leave, but there was something in his tone, something raw, unfamiliar, that made her pause. She glanced toward her apartment window, where she could see Michael's small silhouette drawing at the kitchen table. The sight of him gave her strength. "Talk about what?" she asked finally, crossing her arms. "About how you told me to forget your number. Or maybe about how you decided a child wasn't part of your perfect life." Alexander winced at her words, his composure cracking. "I was wrong," he said simply. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Wrong? You think that word fixes anything?" He took another step closer. "No. But maybe it's a start." She looked away, her throat tightening. For a long time, she had imagined this moment, what she would say if she ever saw him again. But now that it was happening, all she felt was exhaustion. "You don't get to start over, Alexander," she whispered. "You walked away." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with something she never thought she'd see in him, remorse. "I know," he said quietly. "And I've regretted it every day since." Before she could respond, a small voice interrupted them. "Mommy?" Michael stood at the door, holding his drawing, his curious eyes flicking between them. Emma's heart twisted. Alexander turned toward him, his breath catching as if seeing him for the first time all over again. Michael smiled shyly and waved. "Hi again," he said. Emma stepped protectively in front of him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Inside, sweetheart," she said softly. But Michael looked up at her, confused. "That's the man from the park," he whispered. Emma didn't answer. Alexander's expression broke completely. He crouched down, trying to steady his voice. "You draw?" he asked gently. Michael nodded and held out the paper. "It's a fountain," he said proudly. "Mommy says it's our favorite place." Alexander took the drawing carefully, his throat tightening as he looked at the shaky blue lines. Emma stood there, torn between anger and heartbreak, between wanting to protect her son and the faint echo of the love she had once known. When Alexander finally looked up, his voice was barely audible. "He's perfect," he said. "He's yours," she replied, her tone cold but trembling. Then she took Michael's hand, turned, and walked back inside. Alexander didn't try to stop her. He stood there in the fading light, the child's drawing still in his hand, and for the first time in his life, he realized what true loss felt like. The kind that didn't come from business failures or money or pride, but from knowing that the one thing you loved most in the world existed, and you had no right to it. The days that followed were heavy with tension, the kind that made every hour stretch endlessly. Emma tried to return to her routine, to pretend that nothing had changed, but the truth hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. She could feel his presence everywhere, in the quiet street outside her building where a sleek car sometimes parked at dusk, in the subtle way her heart sped up when she passed the park, afraid she might see him again. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her was waiting for him, wondering if he would come back, wondering if he truly meant what he said about regret. It was dangerous, that curiosity. It stirred feelings she had buried long ago, feelings she had promised herself she would never allow to surface again. Michael, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that surrounded them, continued to fill her days with laughter and innocence. He would wake her early, his small hands tugging at her arm, asking for pancakes or stories. He would press his drawings onto the refrigerator with magnets, filling the kitchen with bursts of color and love. To him, life was simple, and Emma did everything she could to keep it that way. But she noticed how his eyes sometimes looked toward the window, as if searching for something, or someone. Once, when she tucked him into bed, he whispered, "That man from the park looked sad, Mommy. Did he lose his family?" Her heart clenched so hard she could barely speak. "Maybe," she said softly. "But some people lose things because they let them go." Across the city, Alexander was unraveling in ways he hadn't thought possible. His office, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. He couldn't focus on numbers or contracts or the endless stream of meetings. Every time he tried to immerse himself in work, his mind drifted back to that small apartment, to the boy with the bright eyes and the cautious smile. He found himself replaying their brief encounter, overanalyzing every detail, the way Emma had stood between them protectively, the way Michael's voice had sounded when he said, "Hi again." He wanted to see them, to talk to Emma properly, to explain himself, though he wasn't even sure what words could possibly make up for what he had done. One evening, he drove past her building again, telling himself he was just taking a detour. But when he saw the warm light spilling from her window and caught a glimpse of her silhouette inside, reading to Michael, her expression soft, her laughter faintly audible even from the street, something inside him cracked. That was what he had thrown away. Not just her, but the family he could have had. He sat there in the car for nearly an hour, watching through the blur of rain on the windshield, until finally he forced himself to leave. He told himself he had no right to be there, but that didn't stop him from returning the next night, or the one after that. Emma noticed him eventually. She was walking home from the grocery store when she saw him standing by his car across the street, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she looked away and kept walking. Her pulse was racing, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled for her keys. When she reached her door, she turned around and found him still there, unmoving. "You need to stop," she called out quietly, her voice low but firm. "This isn't your place anymore." He took a step forward, his expression full of desperation. "I know it's not," he said. "But please, Emma, I can't walk away again. Not now." She exhaled sharply, torn between anger and something softer. "You already did," she said. "Twice, actually. First when you left, and again when you showed up at the park like a ghost from a nightmare." He flinched at her words but didn't argue. "You're right," he admitted. "But I need to make things right. I can't undo what I said, what I did, but I want to be part of his life. I want to be there for him." The mention of Michael made her chest tighten. She crossed her arms, trying to build a wall around herself. "You don't get to just decide that now because you feel guilty," she said. "You think you can just show up and fix everything with a few words? That's not how this works." He ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I'm asking for a chance." For a moment, she saw not the arrogant CEO who had once broken her heart, but a man stripped of all his armor, lost, flawed, and human. That scared her even more than his arrogance ever had, because it made her remember the man she had loved before the walls went up. She wanted to tell him to leave, to never come near them again, but when she opened her mouth, no words came out. Instead, she said softly, "If you want to prove something, then don't hurt him. That's all I ask." Then she turned and went inside, closing the door between them once more. That night, she didn't tell Michael about the encounter, but he seemed to sense that something had changed. He climbed into her bed after a nightmare and whispered, "It's okay, Mommy. You're not alone." She held him tightly, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't know if she was strong enough for what was coming, but she would do anything to protect him. Meanwhile, Alexander lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, her words echoing in his head, "Don't hurt him." He thought about what that meant, about how much he had already hurt both of them without ever meaning to. He realized that if he truly wanted to be part of his son's life, he would have to earn it, not with money, not with power, but with humility. And for a man like him, that was the hardest thing of all. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose that wasn't tied to success or image. It was tied to something real. To a little boy who had smiled at him without knowing who he was. To the woman who had once believed in him and now had every reason not to. It was that night that Alexander made a promise to himself. He would not force his way back into their lives. He would find a way to show them, through actions, not words, that he was no longer the man who had walked away. And maybe, if fate was kind enough, one day Emma would see it too. The next few weeks unfolded like a test neither of them had expected. Emma did her best to maintain the quiet rhythm of her life, but it was impossible to ignore the way Alexander's presence lingered on the edges of it. He didn't approach her again after that night, but somehow she always knew when he was near. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of him from the corner of her eye, standing across the street when she left work, sitting alone on a park bench as she and Michael walked by, pretending to read the newspaper though she could feel his gaze following them. It wasn't invasive, not in a threatening way, but it unsettled her. It was as if he was waiting for permission to breathe again, afraid to take more than what she might allow. At first, she told herself that he would get tired and disappear, that his guilt would fade like everything else from their past. But he didn't. Instead, he began showing up in quieter ways that made her heart ache with confusion. When her car broke down one morning, she found it fixed the next day, the bill already paid and no note left behind. When the library received an anonymous donation that covered the cost of a new children's reading room, she knew, somehow, that he was behind it. It infuriated her, this attempt to fix what couldn't be repaired with money, but it also made her wonder if he was changing, if he was trying to become someone better. One evening, as autumn deepened and the air turned crisp, Emma took Michael to the park to feed the ducks before sunset. The fountain shimmered under the fading light, and the trees glowed gold and amber around them. Michael laughed as he tossed crumbs into the water, his joy so pure it drew smiles from strangers. Emma sat on a nearby bench, lost in thought, when a familiar voice broke through the noise of the park. "May I sit?" She turned to see Alexander standing there, dressed casually for once, his coat open, his eyes uncertain. She hesitated for a long moment before nodding. "You already are," she said quietly, and he sat beside her. For several minutes, they said nothing. The sounds of the park filled the silence, the splash of the fountain, the rustle of leaves, Michael's laughter drifting through the air. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice low. "He looks happy." Emma nodded, keeping her eyes on her son. "He is. He deserves to be." Alexander swallowed hard, his hands clasped together. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said after a pause, "but I've thought about you every day since that night. The words I said, they were cruel. I thought I was protecting myself from something I didn't understand, but all I did was destroy the only good thing I ever had." Emma's chest tightened, but she didn't look at him. "Do you think saying that changes anything?" she asked softly. "Do you think it takes away the years I spent alone, raising him, wondering how I would pay for diapers or food, wondering why the man I loved suddenly decided he didn't want to be part of our life?" Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to stay composed. "You told me to forget your number, Alexander. You made me believe I meant nothing." He turned toward her, his face filled with guilt. "I was a coward," he admitted. "Everything about you scared me. The way you believed in things, in people, in love, it terrified me because I didn't. I grew up thinking emotions made you weak, that love was just another way to lose control. And when you told me you were pregnant, I panicked. I told myself it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. I wanted to believe that walking away was strength, but it wasn't. It was the worst mistake of my life." Emma finally looked at him, her blue eyes hard but glistening. You don't get to rewrite the story now. You left, and I built something without you. You can't just walk back in and expect to be forgiven." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to let me be part of his life. But I need you to know that I'm here. Not to fix things. Not to control anything. Just, here." For a long while, she didn't answer. Michael ran up then, clutching a handful of leaves, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mommy! Look," he said proudly. Then he noticed Alexander and smiled shyly. "Hi again." Alexander's heart clenched. He smiled back, his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy. Those are some great leaves." Michael nodded and held one out to him. "You can have it," he said. Alexander took it carefully, his fingers trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. Emma watched them, her expression unreadable. Something inside her shifted as she saw the way Alexander looked at Michael, not with the pride of ownership, but with awe, almost reverence, as though he couldn't believe something so perfect could exist. When Michael ran off again, chasing a squirrel, she turned back to Alexander. "If you're serious about being here," she said finally, "you'll need to earn it. Not from me, from him. He doesn't need a stranger showing up and disappearing again." He nodded, his throat tight. "I won't disappear." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, then stood. "We'll see," she said softly. "Actions speak louder than promises." Then she called out to Michael, and they began walking toward the park gate. Alexander stayed where he was, the leaf still in his hand, watching them go. For the first time since he had met her, he didn't feel the urge to chase her. Instead, he felt something quieter, steadier, resolve. From that day forward, Alexander began to show up in small, quiet ways. He volunteered at the community center where Michael's daycare was held, anonymously donating books and toys. He never approached them directly, not until Emma made it clear that she was ready. He learned patience, something his old self would have considered weakness. And each time he saw Michael's smile or heard his laugh from across the park, he felt a tiny piece of his old arrogance crumble away. Emma noticed the changes too, even if she pretended not to. She would catch glimpses of him helping a child reach a book, or talking to the staff with genuine warmth instead of his usual polished charm. It confused her more than she wanted to admit. He was no longer the man she had known, the man who had once believed he could buy his way out of consequences. This version of Alexander was quieter, humbler, and she didn't know what to do with that. Late one night, as she sat by the window after putting Michael to bed, Emma realized something that both scared and comforted her: she didn't hate him anymore. The pain was still there, yes, but it no longer consumed her. What she felt now was more complicated, a mix of sorrow, longing, and the faintest spark of hope. She wasn't sure what it meant yet, or whether she could ever let him in again. But as she looked out into the darkness, she knew one thing for certain. He was trying. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Winter arrived quietly that year, coating the city in a thin layer of frost that shimmered under the streetlights. The park where Emma often brought Michael was now a white wonderland, the fountain frozen mid-splash, the trees glistening like glass. Emma bundled her son in his blue coat and knitted scarf, and they spent the afternoon building small, lopsided snowmen while their laughter filled the cold air. It should have been a perfect day, yet she couldn't ignore the constant awareness that Alexander might appear at any moment. Ever since their conversation in the park, she had sensed him hovering at the edge of her life, not intruding, not demanding, simply existing there like a shadow that refused to fade. He had kept his word, though. He hadn't disappeared, nor had he pushed for more than she was willing to give. Every week or two, she would find small signs of him, a new book left at the library's doorstep, a donation slip with no name, or a kind word passed along by someone who had met him at the community center. It was strange, seeing him rebuild himself piece by piece, not through grand gestures but through quiet consistency. And although she never admitted it aloud, Emma found herself waiting for those small traces of him, as if they were proof that people could change after all. One snowy Saturday afternoon, Emma took Michael to a holiday charity event held at a local hotel. It was one of the few places in town big enough to host so many families, and the hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter fairy tale, twinkling lights draped across the ceiling, a massive Christmas tree glittering in the corner, and soft music filling the space. Michael was mesmerized, his small hand clutching hers tightly as he gazed at the decorations. "It's like magic," he whispered, his blue eyes wide with wonder. She smiled, brushing snowflakes from his hair. "It is magic, sweetheart," she said softly. They moved through the crowd, enjoying the festivities, until Emma heard a voice she hadn't expected. "Emma?" She turned and froze. Alexander stood a few feet away, dressed in a dark coat, his hair slightly tousled from the snow, his expression uncertain. For a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow around them, the sounds of laughter and music fading into a dull hum. She hadn't seen him in weeks, and part of her had thought maybe he had finally stopped trying. Seeing him now, she felt a rush of emotions, fear, longing, confusion, all tangled together. Michael noticed him too and immediately smiled. "Mr. Alexander," he shouted, running toward him before Emma could stop him. Alexander crouched down instinctively, catching him in his arms with a soft laugh. "Hey there, buddy," he said, his voice warm. "How have you been?" Michael grinned. "I saw Santa. And I got a cookie shaped like a snowflake." Alexander's eyes softened. "That sounds amazing." Then he looked up at Emma, his smile fading into something quieter. "You look good," he said. "You shouldn't be here," she said automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. "You know that." He nodded. "I do. But I came because of him," he said, gesturing gently toward Michael. "He deserves to know I care. I don't want to hide anymore." Emma opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, Michael tugged her sleeve. "Can he stay with us, Mommy? Just for the tree lighting?" Her heart clenched at the innocent question. She looked down at her son, then back at Alexander, whose eyes held a quiet plea. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, against all logic, she nodded. "Just for the tree lighting," she said softly. They stood together as the crowd began to count down. When the lights flickered on and the enormous Christmas tree burst into color, Michael gasped and clapped his hands, his joy so pure that both adults couldn't help but smile. In that moment, something fragile shifted between them, a small, trembling bridge of shared love for the same little boy. Alexander turned to look at her, and for the first time in years, she didn't look away. The air between them felt heavy with all the things they still hadn't said, yet there was a strange comfort in the silence that followed. Later, when the event ended and families began to leave, Alexander walked them to their car. The snow was falling harder now, soft flakes landing in Emma's hair, melting instantly. "Thank you," he said quietly as she buckled Michael into his seat. "For letting me be here." She closed the door and turned to him. "Don't thank me," she said. "I did it for him, not for you." He nodded slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "I know. But I'm still grateful." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The streetlights cast a warm glow over the snow-covered lot, and the silence between them felt different now, not hostile, not painful, but cautious and uncertain, like the first few steps onto thin ice. "You really are trying, aren't you?" she asked suddenly, her voice quieter now. He looked at her, his expression raw. "I am. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because I can't live with who I was." Emma studied him for a long time, her heart warring with her mind. He looked older, she realized, not in years but in weight, as if the past had carved its lessons into his very bones. "People don't change overnight," she said. "And sometimes they don't change at all." "I know," he said. "But I'd rather spend the rest of my life proving I can than live one more day pretending I don't need to." The honesty in his voice disarmed her. It wasn't the polished charm of the powerful man he had once been, but something stripped bare, honest, vulnerable, real. She took a deep breath and looked away, afraid of what she might see if she met his eyes too long. "Good night, Alexander," she said finally. Then she got into the car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving him standing in the softly falling snow. He stayed there long after the car disappeared from view, his heart both aching and alive in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time, he didn't feel the crushing emptiness that had haunted him since the day he walked away from her. Instead, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close. And for Alexander Hayes, that was enough to keep him standing there in the snow, looking up at the lights, quietly promising himself that no matter how long it took, he wouldn't stop trying to be the man she once believed he could be. Spring came slowly, as if the world itself needed time to heal. The snow melted away, the gray skies softened, and tiny green buds began to bloom on the trees that lined the park where so much of their story had unfolded. Emma had settled into something resembling peace. Life with Michael was full, and she had learned to carry her past not as a wound but as a quiet scar that reminded her of how far she had come. Alexander had kept his word. He never pushed, never demanded. Instead, he appeared gently on the edges of their lives, helping in small ways, respecting every boundary she set. Over time, the tension between them dulled, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected but both had needed. Emma saw him more often now, though always in public spaces. Sometimes he would join them at the park, helping Michael fly his kite or reading with him under a tree. Other times, he would simply watch from a distance until Michael ran up and pulled him into whatever adventure the day offered. The boy had taken to him in a way that both warmed and frightened Emma. She had spent so long protecting Michael from pain, from disappointment, but the way her son laughed when Alexander was near, the way he looked at him with trust and admiration, made her realize she couldn't keep them apart forever. One Saturday afternoon, they were all together at the park again. Michael was chasing bubbles, his laughter echoing through the air, while Emma sat on a bench with a cup of coffee, her eyes following him. Alexander approached quietly, sitting beside her, his presence calm and familiar now. "He's growing fast," he said softly, his eyes on Michael. She nodded. "Too fast sometimes. I feel like I blinked, and he's not my baby anymore." He smiled faintly. "You've done an incredible job with him, Emma. He's kind, smart, confident. Everything a child should be." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "I did what I had to do," she said. "There wasn't another choice." Alexander nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know. And I hate that I wasn't there for you. For either of you." His voice cracked slightly, and when she looked at him, she saw something genuine in his eyes, a depth of remorse that couldn't be faked. "You can't rewrite the past," she said quietly. "But you can decide what kind of person you'll be now." He met her gaze, his expression steady. "I want to be the kind of man my son deserves. And maybe, someday, the kind of man you could forgive." The honesty of his words pierced through her defenses. She had waited years to hear something like that, and yet now that she had, it frightened her. Forgiveness wasn't simple, it wasn't something that could be spoken into existence. But as she looked at him, she realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the pain, it was about accepting that people could grow beyond it. She turned her gaze back to Michael, who was waving at them from across the park, his small hands covered in soap bubbles. "Maybe someday," she said softly. "But not because I owe you that. Because we both deserve peace." He smiled faintly, and for the first time, she saw light in his eyes again. They sat there for a long time, not needing to speak. The silence between them felt different now, not full of pain or regret, but of quiet understanding. It was as if all the storms they had endured had finally calmed into still water. When Michael ran back to them, breathless and laughing, Alexander knelt down and scooped him into his arms, twirling him around until the boy shrieked with delight. Emma watched them, her heart full and aching all at once. It was bittersweet, but it was real. Later that evening, Emma invited Alexander to dinner for the first time. It wasn't planned, it just felt right. They ate together in her small kitchen, the three of them crowded around the table. Michael told stories about his day, his animated hands waving in the air as he spoke, while Emma and Alexander listened, occasionally exchanging quiet glances that spoke more than words ever could. When the meal ended, and Michael had fallen asleep on the couch with his toy truck still in hand, Emma and Alexander sat together in the gentle glow of the lamp. "I used to think I didn't deserve happiness," he said after a long pause, his voice low. "After what I did, after everything I ruined, I thought maybe my punishment was to live with the emptiness I created. But then I saw you both, and I realized that maybe happiness isn't something you're given, it's something you fight for. Something you try to build, piece by piece, no matter how long it takes." Emma looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "You can't undo the pain," she said softly. "But you can choose not to cause more of it. That's where it starts." He reached across the table, hesitated, then gently placed his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. The touch was tentative, uncertain, but it carried the weight of everything they'd survived. "Thank you," he whispered. She shook her head. "Don't thank me yet," she said with a faint smile. "This isn't forgiveness, Alexander. It's something else. A beginning, maybe." He smiled then, a real one, the kind she hadn't seen in years. "A beginning," he echoed. They sat there like that for a long time, the quiet hum of the city outside their window, the warmth of the moment wrapping around them like a fragile promise. Months passed, and slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild something resembling a family. There were awkward moments, mistakes, and days when the past still hurt, but there were also moments of laughter, of tenderness, of hope. Michael grew up surrounded by love, unaware of how close he had once come to being without it. And Emma, strong, brave Emma, learned to let go of the bitterness that had once defined her. She didn't forgive easily, but she did forgive eventually. Because love, she realized, wasn't always about perfection. Sometimes it was about choosing to stay, to believe, even after everything had fallen apart. Years later, on a sunny afternoon in the same park where their story had begun to heal, Alexander watched Emma and Michael walking ahead of him, hand in hand, their laughter echoing through the air. He smiled to himself, the memory of who he used to be fading into something distant and unrecognizable. The man who once told her to forget his number was gone. In his place stood someone who had finally learned what it meant to love without fear, to give without expecting, to stay even when it was hard. And as Emma turned back to meet his gaze, her smile soft and full of warmth, Alexander knew that the life he had once thought he didn't deserve was now his to cherish, not because he had earned it perfectly, but because he had learned never to take it for granted again.